Welcome to Who Are We Adoptive Family 101. So we have two guest presenters that are here with us. We have Caylin Broome, who she is a LCSW, so that is a licensed clinical social worker here in Georgia. And then we also have Katie Miner, and Katie Miner is a LMSW, so she's a licensed master social worker in Texas, and she is also a Chinese adoptee. And as I said before, this webinar is being recorded. Okay, so a little bit about myself. I am a master's level clinical intern. I'm currently at Johns Creek and Alpharetta Counseling with Caylin. Caylin's one of the supervisors there. So I'm an adoptee, and I have experience working with adoptees and family of adoptees through creating family boundaries, creating family conversation about adoption, and answering overall mental processing questions about adoption, and then helping adoptees and adoptive families deal with the fact that there are going to be some unanswered questions that we just will not receive answers for. I graduated from the University of Alabama with a degree in criminal justice. Started out in law school, but now I'm currently pursuing my master's degree at Louisiana State University. So the next person I'd like to introduce is Caylin. And Caylin, if you would like to do your own little brief introduction, that would be great.
Hi everyone. I am Caylin Broome. Like Lyla said, I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I have been here at Johns Creek and Alpharetta Counseling since June 2021. I have been in the field for about 10 years, working in a variety of different settings, different issues, but what really makes my heart sing in terms of my client work is adoption, grief and loss, aging and caregiver dynamics, and any sort of medical illness, chronic condition adjustment. So that is me. Thank you all for being here.
Okay, and then we also have another presenter. Her name's Katie Miner. Like I said, she's an LMSW. Katie, would you like to say a few words?
Yes, of course. So thank you again for letting me talk about my own adoption story. So I am located in Texas. I grew up in Houston, actually, but recently moved to San Antonio. I graduated in May with a master's in social work, and I'm currently doing services in the community for a nonprofit called Family Service. So I help children ages 0 to 8.
Great, thank you, Katie. So I just wanted to go over some objectives so you have a layout for what this presentation will be on. So we are going to be defining adoption and how it impacts the stages of development. We've broken down the stages of development in a kind of creative way. So we have spring being early childhood, summer being adolescence, the middle school years, fall, adolescence, the high school years, and winter is adulthood. So that will be the first portion. And then the second portion will be therapeutic skills application. So we just have 3 sections on communication, acceptance and commitment, and then the tough questions. And then of course we will have the Q&A portion. So adoption. So let's just start the discussion. So obviously everyone here knows what adoption is, but there are different types of adoption. There's interracial adoption, kinship adoptions, closed and open, and then international and transnational. Of course, closed and open are primarily with domestic adoptions here in the United States. It is whether you're able to communicate with that biological family, or the biological family is able to receive information about the adoptee. That's what kind of closed and open is in a nutshell, but there of course are more intricacies that are involved in that. So all children adopted, they go through some issues that are related to adoption throughout their entire lives. So that's whether they're adopted in infancy or they're adopted in early childhood, even in adolescence, and then they're kids who are adopted even at 17. We see those really heartwarming stories. So it's normal for an adoptee to go through a natural grieving process. And of course, that looks different with each adoptee. So spring, early childhood. So of course I wanted to make this presentation not so much of a preaching information to you, but just wanted to include a few personal anecdotes of my own adoption story. So a stork and a pair of glasses. So in my childhood, there used to be drawings that hung in the art room of my parents' house. My dad was an illustrator, and he would always make these birthday cards for my mom, and they would depict what happened to my mom and my dad in the past year. So if you study them closely, you'll find a birthday card that actually has a stork in it, and in the stork's mouth is myself as a baby. So I was born in Anhui, China, and I was abandoned at a train station. I spent 3 months in the orphanage, and then I was brought back to Atlanta, Georgia. Ask me about my childhood, and I'll probably tell you that I knew I was adopted because my parents were not shy about telling me. I went to elementary school at a private school near our home, and I was the typical elementary schooler. I had a crush on this guy, and we had to take the lunch count to the gym, which was in a building next door, and I would always call on the guy. So, I thought that I'm just this typical elementary schooler going to school in the suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia, or so I thought. So back then I knew I was different, but I couldn't put my finger on exactly how. However, I did know I didn't look like my parents, and kids would talk about specific features they got from their biological parents. And I would just sit there because I couldn't relate. I would just keep drawing or coloring, but it did affect me, even if it only affected me subconsciously. So how did I know it affected me subconsciously? Well, I started to want to wear glasses. All of the cartoon figures in those birthday cards had my parents wearing glasses. My mom used to wear these clear colored glasses, and she always used to wear them. And it's almost what I remember the most about her physical feature face growing up. Anyway, I even drew myself in glasses because I really wanted to have a physical feature that my parents had. And I kept bugging my parents for glasses. Yes, I did eventually get glasses, and ask me now about having to pay for contact lenses and having to pay for eye exams. I'd probably say I don't want glasses anymore. But back then it was a piece of my parents that I was able to share. So back then, the little elementary school age me, I really just wanted to look like my parents, and I knew I was different. So Caylin will be doing this portion of the presentation. So Caylin?
Yes. So, in early childhood, one thing I will start out by saying is that in the past several decades, there's been more of a move toward kind of what Lyla is describing, openness about adoption, whether it's connection with the bio family, if that's possible. Generally speaking, that's domestic adoption, but also, talking openly with the adoptee about, that, there used to be a lot of stigma around adoption. I'm thinking about, so I'll share with y'all, my mother was adopted. And she was adopted in the 1950s here in the US. And during that time, that was a domestic adoption. The trend was, don't tell the kid, they'll never know. It's just the same. Getting a baby is like, a blank slate. We know now through relational neuroscience and talking to adult adoptees, that is just not true. Bonding begins in utero. Attachment and bonding begins in utero. So I got to be careful about how I talk about this. Adoption is not experienced as trauma, but the separation from the biological mother can be experienced by adoptees as traumatic, right? So what that is you gestate for 9 months generally. You're born. All the sights, sounds, smells that are familiar to you from that 9-month period are gone suddenly. And so we all are hardwired with survival instinct, right? So to a newborn baby, separation from the mother, and babies are aware, there's research that shows that babies are aware even, within the first few hours of life of who their mother is relative to other adults, right? That's instinct and that's connection. We can tell on kind of this like primal primitive level. Separation from the mother equals death. That's how it's interpreted by our nervous system. So that's what's called, that separation is what's called the primal wound. And there's a good bit of writing about this, what that experience can be on our nervous system, that level of terror, sadness, searching, longing, that even if we don't remember it in a narrative way, because those parts of our brain are not online yet, in the first few years of life, our central nervous system remembers, and the parts of our brain in our limbic system that are responsible for like kind of sensory experiential remembering, right? Something feels familiar, even though, you're not able to kind of like look back and say, okay, yes, I know this feeling from this time, that's there from birth, if not earlier. So say that to say, there's no way that this could be just the same as biological parenting, right? That's not to say that it's not as good, or they're equally valid. They're just different, right? So that, this is just to kind of debunk the idea that this is just the same, right? It's not, because the baby was there. They experienced that separation. So attachment theory, I use that a lot when I work with adoptees. Just the idea that for people adopted as infants, and then especially, as Lyla mentioned, with things like kinship adoption, international adoption, things like that, adoption from foster care, where there might be more of a trauma history due to the child being adopted at an older age. We got to really, attachment and bonding for any newborn is important, right? And that's kind of the skin to skin contact, the reciprocal play, kind of the sensory experiences together, the cuddling, the bath time, even the diaper changes, things like that. With an adoptee, we got to do that plus, right? Not to make up, but with the awareness that there is this attachment wound early on that their central nervous system remembers. So with the ideal, I shouldn't say ideal, but secure attachment is what we're aiming for, right? And so what that says is that, via attachment theory, which was created by John Bowlby in the 1950s, someone who is securely attached has kind of this inner working model of the world that holds that, yes, I can generally trust other people. People are basically good. I can, ask for what I need and generally be supported and received. While I matter, my voice matters, and I'm a unique human being here on my own in this community, right? That's secure attachment. There also are some other attachment styles, kind of anxious preoccupied, where, abandonment fears are strong, whether consciously or not, and anxious avoidant, which is where people, and this is all kind of outside of our conscious awareness, are afraid to get close to other people. And so I'm going to talk a little bit later as we get into kind of the older ages about what that can look like with adoptees, but that's kind of the line that we're walking. So I think, Lyla, that's pretty much all of that. I bounced around a little bit. So in early childhood, like I was saying, with adoptees, it's kind of a mixed bag in many, many respects about what's known about the biological family. Lyla alluded to this too, with domestic, generally speaking, there's more information available about the biological parents and whether, they had prenatal care, say, during the pregnancy, whether there's a history of substance use, domestic violence, things like that. All of these things that impact the baby's wiring, right, because of the prenatal environment. Whether there's a family history of mental or physical illness, all these things that the baby comes into the world with, so again, no such thing as a blank slate here when it comes to a child. So because of the, just kind of an average, in these types of situations, this is not always a pregnancy where everything goes exactly right. Appointments are made, prenatally, nutrition's attended to. A lot of times, for biological families, resources are scarce. Maybe they don't have the support to be able to kind of do everything exactly right when it comes to their pregnancy. So we do see kind of this higher incidence of things like ADHD, learning disability, trauma-related symptoms, which is related to that primal wound, that attachment wound that I mentioned, depression, anxiety, and things like that. So when I work with adopted kiddos, I kind of see things fall into kind of two separate tracks here, internalizing versus externalizing behaviors. So internalizing behaviors, a lot of times that, both stem from fear in many cases, right? Abandonment fear, feelings of shame, things like that. And so internalizing behaviors might look like anxiety, depression, the idea of I'll be a rule follower, I'll be quiet, I'll be good, I'll be predictable, in order to make ourselves more palatable. A lot of times these can look like overachievers. Often people, teachers, parents, adults in their life don't necessarily see that this kid actually might be hurting, right? Because you see the quiet kid in the class who always does their work and turns in everything on time and never makes a fuss. That's also not typical for children either, right? Kids, kids aren't meant to be quiet, still, perfect, predictable, right? So these kids I find tend to fly under the radar a little bit more. We might not know that they're suffering or they have these questions because they're not going to articulate them. A lot of times they're afraid of upsetting their family if they live in a family where their adoption isn't talked about openly, where it's not okay to say, hey, I find myself thinking about my birth mom on my birthday, say, things like that. Externalizing behaviors, kind of polar opposite, right? It comes from the same kind of fear place. Shame a lot of times drives it, but this is kind of more like limit testing. It can look like conduct problems. It can look like attitude problems. It's kind of the cliche of, in many cases, pushing people away to see who will stay. And a truth about humans is that, generally speaking, we act in the way that gives us the outcome we expect, not necessarily the outcome we want. So if we're following a story we know, so say if I'm expecting people to leave me, if I'm moving throughout the world as with this being a given in my mind that people will leave me at some point, this idea that there's something wrong with me, that in many cases can become a self-fulfilling prophecy if that's how I carry myself. So those kids, I will say, are more likely to end up in my office because those, can be read by teachers and parents as problem behaviors, whereas the kids with the more internalizing behaviors, it might not be as noticed. Both are equally in need of support. Internalizing behaviors and the stuff that doesn't get addressed a lot of times can go on to kind of bigger things the older the person gets, kind of, eating disorder, substance use, suicidality, things like that, that are very kind of internal experiences rather than these conduct problems and aggression. So in early childhood, there may be some awareness of differences between their self, other family members, and their peers, as Lyla is alluding to. Sometimes that can, especially in transracial adoption, look, like differences of, being aware that you're of a different race and maybe seeing how this impacts how you're treated socially compared to other people. And so, all these things I'm mentioning get more and more nuanced, right? The older the child gets, our understanding as our brain develops, and we learn to see things, maybe a little bit more abstractly, hold a little bit more ambiguity. All of these things will get more and more complex, but this is kind of the stuff that's starting out there even in early childhood. And often it's just a question of whether the adoptee is in an environment where it's safe for them to articulate these things. So we have a lot of cultural ways. I've said this has come a long way since my mom was adopted in the 1950s, but I still think that we have a long way to go in terms of how culturally we understand adoption. I think often people go into it with rose-colored glasses, not understanding that this comes with a lot of unique challenges. Adoption is a solution to a problem, and that is babies and children without safe places to live. And our expectation can't be that the child will be grateful. This is something I hear a lot. People say, oh, she must be so grateful that you saved her from this life or this difficult experience. And that's, a lot of parents find themselves feeling, a little unsure or maybe disappointed that that's not the case, And so for that, I really encourage anyone considering adoption, really examine what are your motives for doing so. Don't go into it with an expectation of gratitude or that your child owes you anything. So with that, like I said, I'm a grief counselor first and foremost. I do see a lot of disenfranchised grief in adoptees and adoptive families. And so what that means is grief that's not understood culturally as being grief. And so what that can mean is, as Lyla said, grieving, the loss of the relationship with the biological parents, grieving the fact that we may never get all the answers that we would possibly want about who we are and where do we come from. The fact that, society might not understand what it's like to be us. We're told, oh, you should be grateful for the life that you have. And this is a big one for me. Your birth mother loved you so much that she gave you up. Because, a lot of times child adoptees especially hear that and they think, okay, well, what does that mean? She loved me. Does she love me now? Does she think about me? Do people who love you leave? Things like that, oh, she couldn't take care of you. Okay, am I too much? All these things that people, and I will say, I think generally speaking, people have good intentions, but through child ears, they can draw some conclusions about this that actually might be kind of harmful. So again, quality of life is subjective. What's really pushed back against when people are talking about giving someone a better life, because this is not, this is not picture perfect over here either. This is just different challenges. Especially with transracial adoption too. I've heard from so many people, the impact of what it's like to be a different race from their family and how that's understood socially, is minimized in many cases. A close friend of mine was adopted transracially in a very, we'll say, a very white community. And, his race was never talked about. And that led to kind of a big identity crisis in his adolescence and young adulthood, because he felt different and no one was saying it, which felt a little bit like gaslighting at a point. So the apple metaphor, this is something I heard on NPR, and this is a guide that I give parents to talk about hard topics with kids. So those of us who have spent time with kiddos know how kids tend to eat, right? So it's like, if you give them an apple, right, what are they going to do? They're going to take a bite. They're going to set it down. They're going to forget about it for like a half hour, 2 hours, something like that. They'll pick it back up, get it, oh, now it's in the couch. You find it while you're cleaning, tomorrow or whatever. That's how it is with these hard conversations, right? It's important with the kiddos in our life to be receptive when they have questions, when they have thoughts or comments or things that they're not sure about. Don't give them more information than they're asking for at the time, and trust that they understand the door is open for that conversation and that you're following their lead there. This is not going to be one conversation, because their understanding is going to change at each developmental stage, as we'll see. I think that's that, Lyla.
So now we are at summer. So this is adolescence and this is the middle school years. Okay. So Harry Potter, Sedona, and grandparents, oh my. So in middle school, I was still attending the private school. I was also in ballet, so lots of stress, lots of time commitments. And I remember these steps down by the school. I went to Woodward Academy in College Park, and I'd walk up the steps, and every time I'd walk up the steps, I would think about Harry Potter and how I wished I was in that world, as nerdy as that sounds. Now you might be asking, like, how does that relate to adoption, and how does that relate to Sedona? So I had really bad anxiety in middle school, and I also had bad separation anxiety from my parents. My parents were and still are my best friends, but I would just think throughout a day that I would hope nothing bad would happen to them while I was separated from them. And I felt like if I was around them, if I was spending quality time physically with them, then at least I would know if something bad would happen. At least I would be able to prevent it. Now being super busy with ballet and school, I wasn't able to be around them 24/7. So I began to use distractions like thinking about Harry Potter, because it was this magical world where amazing things could happen. So at this point, I want to self-disclose and say I had no intention of wanting to meet my biological parents when I was in middle school. So my mom's dad lived in Phoenix, Arizona, and whenever we'd visit, we would go to Sedona, Arizona, which is a little bit north. It's a beautiful place. The reason why this place is significant is because it helped me develop a love for my grandparents. I loved my mom's parents. I loved my dad's parents. And my relationship with my grandparents was significant because I found a level of acceptance with my grandparents without a blood relation. So that was my first taste of having family and realizing family didn't have to be biological. And I was already an anxious kid. So when we went to Sedona, I realized I wasn't anxious. We'd stay at this Best Western hotel and I would just be in heaven. And I formed an attachment with Sedona because it gave me a sense of safety and security, which I would eventually learn is something I was looking for in my middle school years because of my adoption, because of something that I couldn't even remember, and because of that initial separation and loss at birth. So that's kind of what I was dealing with in middle school. And then we'll continue on.
So another theory I like to use really with, adoptees I work with, but people who see me for other things too, is Erik Erikson's psychosocial stages of development. And so basically what this is that at each kind of developmental stage of life, there's what he calls a crisis, which is a little bit possibly overstating it, but basically there's a task of this developmental stage, and that's to resolve like this versus this, right? Okay, so in early childhood, so birth through about 2 years old, that's basic trust versus basic mistrust. Does the child learn, kind of what I was saying with attachment theory, that I can trust other people, generally speaking, that my needs will be met, that people generally have good intentions, are here to help me, and I can trust myself, all of that, then that's just in the first couple of years of life. There are more stages just at each one, but I've only picked out the ones that are the most relevant to what we're talking about today. So, okay, so this is thinking about adolescence. So what this theory holds, that kind of the main thing to resolve here is identity versus role confusion. So those of us familiar with adolescents and teens know that this is such a big time of exploration. People go through phases, they'll change their style of dress, what they're interested in peer group, what they want to be when they grow up, all these things, sometimes even on like, a weekly basis in many cases. So this is a big period of trying things on, essentially. And so for an adoptee, what that means is that this can kind of fan the flames of these questions again. Maybe this hasn't been a big thing that people are reflecting on before, maybe not, but this can kind of reopen that wound of, okay, well, who am I? And, why am I the way that I am? And, my biological family, what did they do? What are they like? What is their, what are their values? All these questions that in many cases there just aren't answers for, especially in the case of international adoption, where it's not a case of the information is out there, like with domestic maybe, and it's a question of searching if you choose to or not. Many cases with international, especially, it's a question of don't know and can't know because records aren't there. And that's hard. So there's this kind of very normative exploration that goes on during this developmental stage. And so just to kind of round that out for adoptees in particular, this can kind of be triggering in some way. It's just kind of reactivating these questions and this reflection. Like I was saying before, as we develop, our brain is still very much in development until we're about 25 years old, when the prefrontal cortex is fully developed. And so adolescence is a big time for brain formation and shaping. As we see, people tend to grow pretty fast in terms of their abilities and their understanding of the world. So, that in conjunction with everything else might lead to a more nuanced understanding, maybe some deeper questions about the reasons for adoption. What is, my role in the world, relative to other people, is the world fair and just, or is it not? Can I, expect safety most of the time or not? These are some big questions that we all face. And for adoptees, in my experience, it can really be compounded very much so by that early separation. This is, again, those of us who have spent time with teens will know this is a time of life where the peer group becomes incredibly important, right? So peers have a stronger influence over family. For most teens during the adolescent years, there's like this kind of natural drift away from parents, more time spent with friends and doing school activities and stuff like that. And for adoptive families, that can be a difficult dynamic. That can feel like another loss in some respects, or adoptive parents might see that as being a rejection. I hear parents say all the time to me, I just miss my son, or I miss my daughter. We used to have such a close relationship, and now, the teen years and this and that. And, a lot of what I do is just educating. Some of that is normal and adoptive, and that means that things are progressing as they should, right? Because if you think about human development over time, this is the time, back centuries ago, when people would set out on their own. It seems a little young by today's standards, but that's what it was. So that can create another complicated dynamic within the family system. Onset of puberty, oh my gosh, I see that especially in girls with ADHD who are adoptees too. Something about onset of menses seems to exacerbate the ADHD and kind of all the mental health considerations that they might already have, that kind of can really turn up the heat on that. But puberty in particular, for many people, can be a trigger because, what do we say to girls, or people who menstruate? Oh, you can have a baby now, or maybe they are the age that their birth parent was, when they had them, that can trigger more reflection too. Impulse control, that might be an issue from childhood, but, with adolescents, especially with things like driving and parties and sex and substance use, the stakes are much higher. Limit testing behavior, again, that may have been present earlier on, but with adolescence, there's more opportunity to do that with higher consequences. And so this can look like a lot of acting out, again, a lot of kind of conduct problems, or maybe, in some cases, maybe promiscuity, looking for attachment, looking for closeness, and maybe not having the resources, mentally to be discerning about where we find that, and so all of this is kind of rolling into this inner working model of the world, that the adoptee carries, about, who am I? What is my role here? What can I expect of other people? Hyper independence is another big one. Again, with that internalizing and externalizing behavior kind of dichotomy that I raised earlier, hyper independence can look like the responsible kid, the perfectionistic kid, the kid in the family that no one has to worry about because she's going to be quiet. I say she, it could be a he. They're going to be quiet and good and predictable and get all their work done. And we don't need to do that. We don't need to worry about them. Or it could look like a kid with conduct problems who has figured out how to get their needs met, what they see their needs as being, by hook or by crook. They're, hyper independence can look like stealing. It can look like lying. It can look like manipulative behavior, all things very common among adoptees, actually. I try to explain to parents that generally speaking, this is not willful defiance. This is not, a kid or a teen who's causing problems on purpose. This is someone who is hurt. Their nervous system holds a memory of being, in their mind, being abandoned, right? That initial separation. This is someone who doesn't trust that they can articulate their needs and have them be met, or that they can't count on other people. So that can be at the core. And again, abandonment fear, susceptibility to peer pressure. My gosh, in adolescence, right? Again, that peer group is sacrosanct. And so if you are afraid of rejection, that might lead to maybe poor social decision making, doing things to fit in and things like that, because you're afraid of, okay, well, what if they don't like me? What if this group rejects me? So same issues playing out, again, higher stakes.
So now we're going into fall adolescence, the high school years. And Caylin?
Yes. So I think I kind of covered some of this in what I just said, again, it's very similar issues, but the stakes just raise the older that we get, generally speaking. Like I say, in continuation of the issues present during early adolescence, but with raised stakes, because I think also too, I see this, the older the kid gets chronologically, for whatever reason, I shouldn't say for whatever reason, but the expectations for their behavior are raised the older they get. And so that's one thing that I really encourage parents, adoptive parents, to keep in mind. Yes, your kid's chronological age might be 16, 17. Developmentally, where are they though? With a trauma history, learning disabilities, ADHD, things like that, right? So, I hear so many parents say to me, oh, they're 15 years old. This shouldn't be an issue anymore. They're acting like they're 10 or, whatever, things like that. And sometimes, yes, I would never want to invalidate the challenge that creates within a family. And at the same time, it's these two different things. How old are they developmentally versus how old are they chronologically? And in terms of expectations for behavior, it is more relevant to consider everything else than just the child's age on paper. So another potentially triggering thing is, the initial experiences with intimate relationships, that move toward someone in a romantic sense, the vulnerability inherent in that. Definitely sexual encounters, sometimes the thing that happens is almost this intergenerational repeating of the pattern. Maybe the adoptee will get pregnant around the same age as the biological parent. That's the thing that happens, and sometimes it's a fluke, sometimes that's an unconscious attempt to kind of identify with that parent. So again, these kind of big questions: what is my role in relation to others? Can I be both vulnerable with another person and stay safe, or do I need to keep those guards up? Can I show up as my whole self and not be rejected? Big questions for all of us, no matter what.
Okay, so now we're in winter, which is the last stage, and this is adulthood. Okay, so this section's called No, Really, It's Actually a Problem. So I was an anxious kid in middle school, and I was looking for safety and security. And entering high school, that switched, and I was looking for answers. So I was dealing with tough questions like, where are your real parents? How much did you cost? I dealt with that in elementary school and middle school as well, but I don't think I was consciously aware of exactly what implications those questions held. So I also had to come to terms with the fact that even though I hadn't wanted to meet my biological parents growing up, I probably would never be able to even be presented with the opportunity. So that would mean that I would never get to know where my physical features came from. So my adulthood came with a level of acceptance, and in some portions of it, it was extremely difficult, but I did it and I continue to do it. I went to college, joined a sorority, started seriously dating, and surprise, issues that stemmed from my adoption became present to me in the moment, and it started to affect me. So growing up, I was a people pleaser. I really wanted people to like me and accept me. So like Caylin said, that was huge in my life growing up. And I cared a lot about what people thought about me in college. So it followed me. So I realize now that it stemmed from just not wanting rejection. So that's another thing Caylin touched on. And it was this idea that I didn't want the feeling that my body felt at birth when I had that connection with my biological parents severed. So I'd also realized that, and Caylin touched on this as well, that I didn't give up on romantic relationships easily. So I didn't want to reject someone or give up on someone because I wouldn't want that done to myself, which stems back to the idea of adoption. So I eventually did learn healthy boundaries. I learned what a stable interpersonal relationship looked like. And I learned how to recognize when it's healthy to walk away and how it's not quote unquote giving up on someone. So after college, I went to law school, loved it, loved criminal law, but it just wasn't the right fit for me. So during that time, COVID hit, and I did a lot of introspection, and I realized that growing up, it would have helped to have an older adoptee who could kind of help guide me and help show me exactly what it meant to be an adoptee, because a lot of these issues that I was dealing with, abandonment, security issues growing up, I didn't realize stemmed from my adoption. So at that point, I did start a program called Adopted, Chosen, Loved. I hope it's reinstated someday. It's not going on right now, but it was a mentorship program that paired older adoptees with younger adoptees. And specifically, the program was for interracial adoption from China. But anyway, so this all led me to discover my love for helping others and my want to really make a difference in the level of education in the adoption world that were provided. And so that kind of led me to thinking about adoption in the stages of life and how it affects it, how it affects our outlooks on the world, affects our different anxieties that we have growing up. Anyway, but as I said, now I'm at LSU, about to graduate in May. And so even though I'm on this journey, I still am on a journey to learning what it means to be an adoptee. But through intense education, I've learned that a lot about what adoption is, about what it means, and just how it affects and touches every area of our life, whether we acknowledge it or not. Anyway, and I just wanted to make this personal anecdote that I care about each adoptee's journey. We all do that are hosting this presentation, and whether positive, challenging, traumatic, sad, happy, I think that educating adoptees and adoptive families on exactly what potential issues could arise growing up is a great way to start. So now Katie is another adoptee she was adopted from China, and she's now an LMSW in Texas. And so I want to turn it over to her so that she can kind of share with you her adoption story so that you get each adoptee's journey is different. So here's just another perspective on adoption. So Katie.
Thank you so much again for letting me share. And I noticed when Lyla was speaking, we had some similarities with some of the issues that we face, although, as she mentioned, each adoption story can be a little bit different. So again, my name is Katie. I was born in Wuhu, Anhui Province in China, in the midst of a one-child policy where families were only allowed to have one child. So my adoption was a close adoption. And so the only information that I had was that I was found in front of a police station. And so looking back on it, it led to a lot of questions, like, where did I come from? Who did I look like? You know, what happened to my family? I spent 5 months in an orphanage, and I was adopted by a mom in Texas as a single mom. But I always searched for belonging and acceptance. And I grew up in an area that was predominantly white. So there wasn't a lot of people that looked like me, that had darker skin or slanted eyes like me. So I knew that I was different. And I was also the only one who was adopted in my immediate family. But I did find belonging and acceptance giving back to my community. And that's why I became a social worker. And I just wanted to end with that adoption and my journey, it's a lifelong journey. And there'll be ups and downs, but I have to have that belonging and acceptance in order to grow.
Absolutely. Thank you, Katie. And so, Caylin?
Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. Okay. Yes. So I just want to kind of touch on what Lyla and Katie both said about this being lifelong. I think that, again, overly rosy view of life in general, right? Whether we're talking about adoption or grief, I think there's this idea that one day we'll get to the other side of this issue and then things will be just fine. And I think that very little in life is actually like that. With my grief clients, I use kind of the analogy of, okay, we're not working to resolve, we're working to integrate this into our life, right? So if you think about, baking and kneading dough, right? You have the dough in front of you and then maybe you have some flour sprinkled on and you work it in there, right? Maybe there's some butter, you work it in, right? And soon you can't separate the butter and the flour from the rest of the dough, right? It's part of it. And that's what this is. We're working to kind of have this idea of, I can love and be grateful for the life that I have, and I can feel sadness and anger and frustration and confusion for the things I don't know, the things that hurt. And neither one of these things cancels each other out. They're side by side. Whether it's grief, whether it's adoption, I see this a lot in my my clients I work with that have health challenges as well. Very much a both and. So in adulthood, going back to Erickson's theory, the kind of the thing to resolve here is intimacy versus isolation. And so a lot of what that looks like is, lots of dating, romantic relationships, finding a partner, or, I would say I would include even close friendships there too. I think there's a lot of ways to be intimate with people and have meaningful relationships. Doesn't have to just be a romantic partner. But again, these trust issues and this feeling of, can I really be vulnerable? And emotionally naked, I guess we'll say, and wholehearted, and not worry about having that true self rejected. For most adoptees at this stage, they've settled somewhat, they've met developmental tasks and milestones in some way, generally speaking, because we are, I think humans are all resilient. We have a part of us that wants to keep going no matter what. And in many cases, we find a way to make it work, even with this lack of resolution, even with this pain in some cases. But there are several experiences during, adulthood that can still kind of activate those questions again, that emotional pain, in some cases, even that nervous system trauma. So, a lot of times that might look like getting married. Gosh, like I can't think of very many more vulnerable experiences than getting married. Having your own child, I shouldn't say your own. This is actually, language bias that we have in our culture. Your adopted child is your own child as well. Having your biological child, if you choose to do it that way, that can be another emotional trigger. Infertility, if that's something that you experience too, maybe your adoptive parents dealt with that and that was part of their reason for adopting. There are so many other things. Death of an adoptive parent. Can also, that can feel like another loss too. Your nervous system already remembers that separation from your biological mother, so losses of your adoptive parent might hit even harder. Then also too, even just the passage of time, at a point we might reach a certain age in adulthood where we realize, okay, mathematically, even if it's unlikely that my birth parents are still living, and even on a cognitive level, that's hard to think about. Lack of a medical history, that's a tough one for a lot of people, and a lot of people don't think about it, every time, adoptees go to the doctor, in many cases, there has to be kind of, maybe the question marks put on the form or, the note, I know my mom will always write adopted, no medical history, and that's hard, very hard. And just kind of this idea of lack of a, continuous sense of self throughout time and in personal context. Again, these questions of, where did I come from? How did I come to be, even before, I ended up with my adoptive family. And again, having, creating a family, with a partner and however you choose to have children, if you choose to, that can reactivate some of those questions. So overall, I think it's just important to remember that among adoptees, there is a higher incidence of mental health disorder for many, many reasons, which is why support and understanding of this just culturally is so critical. Adoption competent therapists, are very critical. I've heard stories of people, therapists even who supposedly have clinical training, about, be able to do this. Say very invalidating things to their clients who are adoptees, maybe minimizing what this experience actually is. In many cases, there is a higher rate of substance use and suicidality over the course of a lifetime. So again, I do want to just clarify, this is not me saying don't do adoption, right? Adoption is a solution to a social problem that we have, which is safe homes for babies and children, right? I really, really encourage people before they consider moving forward with it, though, really, really reflect on, do I have the resources to be able to support doing this? I'm a former home study evaluator, actually. And so one thing that I would frequently talk about, especially among families that were adopting a child who was of a different race than they were, and the majority of their community, asking them those kind of hard questions. Would you be willing to move, to a more diverse area where your child might be able to see people sometimes who look like them, have role models, not feel like the only one who's not of a certain race in their community? Would you be willing to cut off a family member or a friend if that person said something racist or hurtful? Are you willing to do whatever it takes? And because sometimes that's what's needed. I think every single adoptive family I've ever worked with has said some version to me of, I didn't know this could happen. This is not to scare anybody, but it's just to say, this is one solution. It's not perfect. Nothing is. It comes with unique challenges and support needs. And there's also a lot of beauty and meaning to be found there too. It's both and. So that is it for me.
Thank you, Caylin. So now let's talk some skills. So I don't know what to say. So how do we communicate about how we're feeling about adoption? So developing healthy relationships is key to adoptees, to adoptive families. Communication is a really good start to setting our boundaries and respectfully and healthily maintaining our relationships. Now, you might be asking, how does this help adoptive families specifically? So a lot of times I hear people expressing an issue of not knowing how to communicate a boundary or communicate a feeling. And I see that a lot in adoptees. So I'm in some of those adoptee forums, and adoptees will post saying, I don't know how to communicate this boundary. I don't know how to communicate how I'm feeling to my adoptive mom or to a friend who said something insensitive. So I think these skills are actually really important to adoptees because adoptees have a lot of feelings, and sometimes it's hard for them to express those feelings. And so utilizing these two little acronyms might actually give adoptees a way to communicate their feelings, set their boundaries, and maintain a level of self-respect. So the first one is Dear Man. So that's a want or a need for boundaries. So it basically breaks down to being describe, express, assert, reinforce, and then being mindful, appearing confident in what you're saying, and then just being willing to negotiate. So basically some examples of this would be like adoptees that need some space. So they could describe why they're needing space, express the reasoning for their feelings behind needing space, asserting themselves, reinforcing that they do need that space, being mindful though of who they're talking to. So we always want to incorporate a level of compassion towards the person that we're talking to, but we also want to be confident in our own needs. So a lot of times I see people say, oh, but I feel like if I say this, someone will feel bad. So appearing confident means that you're not putting down what the other person's feeling, but you're just confident that you need some space. And then negotiating is almost to be construed as you're willing to see what the other person needs as well, without having to, go back on what you need. So this formula just allows a person to express their feelings in a manner in which is healthy to the person who is expressing the boundary and then the person who's receiving the message, right? And so it just allows for healthy expression. So I also think Dear Man skills can make difficult conversations a little bit easier. And so what this kind of looks like in adoptive families, so for you adoptive parents that are looking for ways to communicate with your kids, it could be, you need to express a certain boundary with your adopted child, or with your children in general. Like Caylin said, we're all children. And so I think that that's a really important skill to have. So kind of moving into the second one, stick to our values. Personally, I think this one's really important when it comes to people who ask those tough questions of you, like how much did you cost? Where are your real parents? Fast skills just help a person maintain a level of self-respect. So kind of what's on the screen, like being fair, you don't apologize, you stick to your values and you're truthful. So like this formula can be used to say no in a healthy way. So if something's too much, like if that question's too much, or if a conversation is too much in the moment, like someone wants to ask you about, oh, why did you adopt? Or if you're an adoptee, someone's asking you, oh, did your real parents just not know, like, did they just give you up? Or if something rubs you the wrong way. So you can approach it with fairness in mind, and you don't have to make apologies for the way you're feeling. So some examples for adoptees would kind of be adoptees needing to express that they don't want to have a particular conversation with friends, or adoptees needing space from certain conversations. And that kind of applies to adoptive parents as well. So I know these acronyms, it's easier to fit things in. So you can immediately put something in the D, something in the E, something in the A, something in the R, and then you formulate this way of communicating with others that will just help you, maintain healthy relationships. So I think that communication is key in adoptive families, and also key in how adoptive families relate to families that do not understand what adoption is, because adoption has not touched their lives. So communication is one skill. So the beach ball is acceptance and commitment. So to be honest, when I was looking at acceptance and commitment theory, there's not much research that's been done with it, particularly with adoption, but I think it's kind of relevant. So exactly what is the unknown? So the unknown is really difficult. So as Caylin said, it's not knowing answers to questions, not knowing medical history. It's not knowing, and it's actually accepting the fact that you're not going to know. So how is adoption different? So I'm not saying worse, not saying better. I'm just saying different than other therapeutic issues. So what issues that adoptees feel are different, because usually in therapy, I find this, I'm not sure if Katie and Caylin feel this way, but I feel like we give a client skills to resolve issues, right? We give them skills to take into their real life, and they're able to apply the skill and resolve an issue. How I see adoption being different is that we're unable to answer the unknown questions, right? So that's kind of what leads me to acceptance and commitment therapy. It's that we're not able to give adoptees a skill that will help them solve the questions, answer the mystery. We're just not. So that's what leads me to acceptance and commitment therapy. So remember when you're pushing like a beach ball down in the pool and it just keeps popping back up? So an analogy I like to go over with adoptees is like suppression, acceptance, and like waves of processing when the ball comes back towards us. So suppression of those feelings of, if you're feeling sad, angry, upset, that you're not going to know the answers to those questions, is like pushing down the beach ball. It's going to come back up, even in different ways that you don't realize. So even if it's subconscious, it'll pop back up. So acceptance is that the beach ball will always be there in the pool, right? So imagine you're in like the 4 feet, the beach ball can be floating the deep end. Eventually the waves will bring it back towards you, but it's like, you don't want to keep pushing it underwater. You want to start learning how to process what's going on, process the unknown questions, process the different feelings you're having towards your biological parents that you probably won't be able to express to your biological parents. I know some of these skills are more geared towards adoptees, but I think that these could be skills that you could discuss with your adoptee, and they might be able to relate to it. So cognitive diffusion and fusion. So this one's a little bit tricky. I did this in a group once and a lot of people were confused, so it's okay. But so I have some like cognitive distortions below. They're just generalized ones, like I'm hated, I'm unwanted, and I'm ugly. Some other distortions could be my kid is doing this, so I'm a bad parent, or oh, you know, adoption wasn't for me because I'm dealing with some issues with my adoptive kid. So let's talk about what cognitive fusion is first. So I like to talk about cognitive fusion like a Band-Aid. So cognitive fusion is where it sticks, like to where all your negative distortions, like the I'm hated, I'm unwanted, I'm ugly, I'm a bad parent, I'm a bad kid, they stick to you and you think that they're real, right? So you're so into them that you can't see them just being what they are, which are thoughts, right? So diffusion is where you're able to recognize that we're all going to have negative distortions about ourselves. But that doesn't mean that they're real, right? They're just thoughts that are passing through. So I usually use the "is it cake" analogy. So there's a Netflix show where people make real objects out of cake. So you can put like the real object next to the cake and they look exactly the same. So you don't really know which one is real until you cut it, like until you actually go towards it and you start processing the facts of like, oh, I can see a little ridge here. So applying that to the negative distortions about ourselves, especially when it comes to adoption, like I'm unwanted, I'm ugly, I'm hated, or I'm a bad parent, or I'm a failure at this. They look like cake. I mean, they look real, right? But then when you start fact checking them, or when you start going up closer to them, they're not real. Like you cut into them and they're cake. So I think it's kind of, it's a way to conquer the negative distortions and tell ourselves that although we're going to have to deal with negative thoughts, they don't have to fuse to us. They don't have to be real to us. We can process them and we can fact check them. So that is my acceptance and commitment beach ball and cake theory on adoption. So the last skill is just a skill related to tough questions. So exactly how do we deal with tough questions surrounding adoption? So some of the tough questions are ones that have been brought up by Katie, Caylin, and myself throughout this presentation, like how much did you cost? Where are your real parents? Like for adoptive parents, it could be, oh, you just couldn't have your own kid. So how can we help ourselves address questions like these? So the first thing is you don't really owe them an answer. Like they're not owed an answer to any of their questions. So the first little pinpoint is what's owed, and it's nothing, right? You don't owe them an answer. The second point is exploration and discussion should be allowed. So adoptive parents and adoptees should discuss, explore what adoption means to them. And it kind of stems into number 3, which is confidence, because if there's already been a discussion about these tough questions, there will be confidence in answers that your kids can present to their peers. Or, you know, adoptive parents, if you talk to other adoptive parents in process or talk to your spouse in process, then you'll have some confidence in answers when you're presented with them. Another thing that's really important is adoption vocabulary. So if you want to educate others about adoption, you can. But this is when I kind of like to go into each adoptee is unique. Each adoptee has a different story. Each adoptive parent has a different story. So it's important to establish what your vocabulary is, right? So what do you define as real in your family? What does your adoptee define as real? What does the adoptive parent define as real? So it's really important to determine what works best for your family. And then the fifth one is recognition that all adoptees are different. And then kids can be quotation marks cruel, even without meaning it. So some kids just ask really terse, tough questions. And it is cruel because it hurts you, it hurts your adoptee. So just recognizing that fact. So the last thing I have to give you is a little acronym that says you're safe. It's the word safe, and it's your options on how to respond to these tough questions. And so I kind of came up with this, and some people use a combination of both. Some people just use one, but safe is you can step away, so you can disengage yourself from the conversation. You can assert your boundaries. You can engage the funny bone. I actually hear some adoptive parents have talked to me about how their adoptee actually answers these questions in a very funny way, and it's their way of dealing with it, and also just being able to be themselves. Like some adoptees just want to, it's a tough question and they're like, okay, I'm going to be funny about it, which is perfectly fine. And then E is educate. So you can always choose to educate the person who's asking you. So, in a question of how much did you cost, you could educate the non-adoptive person on what exactly the costs of adoption are, which are just, you're not buying the baby, which is really tough for some kids to convey that to other kids because, they're kids. They think that, if you were just picked up from China, I got this, then you were bought. But it's costs of adoption. It's costs of being in labor in the hospital. There are costs associated with having a child, but you're not buying the child. So I think SAFE is just a great acronym to keep in mind when it comes to how do you engage in tough questions, whether you're an adoptive parent or an adoptee. So I'm going to just skip this slide for 1 second because there's some resources that I just wanted to give you all. And I will put these in the chat once I'm going to exit out of here so we can do the Q&A and just look at each other's faces. But so brain body parenting, how to stop managing behavior and start, I don't know, I can't read past the thing, but raising resilient kids, I think is what it is. That's a great book. It's not specific to adoptive parenting, but it's specific to parenting, especially if you have kids who are kind of exhibiting some tough behaviors. W.I.S.E Powerbook is great for kids who are younger, who might want to learn exactly what adoption is, what their adoption story is. And it's a little workbook. I think it's $15 online. So that's a great resource. And then Dr. Chaitra Werda-Leaker is a great psychologist. She's an adoptee herself, and she is an adoptive parent, and she specializes in trauma and adoption work. She owns her own private practice. If you go to her website, she has a ton of different webinars that you can actually pay to watch. And it's specifically on topics that relate to foster care and adoption. So she's honestly, the website's just a fantastic resource. So if you want to check it out, it's beyond words. And I think she's a great resource.